My family invited me to a luxury dinner in Chicago, then handed me a $12,000 bill in front of the entire restaurant. My name is Adele Carson, and for most of my life I believed there were only two things a woman could truly depend on when everything else started falling apart: her work and her family. I was wrong about one of them. 3 years ago, I walked away from my family after a fight that started over money and ended with my father telling me never to come back. After that night, nobody called me. No birthday messages. No holidays. No checking in to see if I was okay. Just silence stretched across 3 long years like I had never existed in the first place. I told myself I was better off without them. I focused on my career, worked longer hours, stayed busy enough to avoid thinking about the people I used to spend every Christmas morning with. But no matter how independent you become, there's still a part of you that hopes your family will eventually miss you. Even after they've given you every reason not to trust them anymore. Then one Thursday afternoon, completely out of nowhere, my mother called me while I was sitting in traffic outside downtown Minneapolis. I almost ignored it because I didn't recognize the number. Her voice sounded fragile and careful, like she'd spent hours practicing what she wanted to say. She told me your father wants to make things right. She said the family misses you. She said everyone was getting together Saturday night for dinner at this upscale steakhouse downtown, and it wouldn't feel complete without me there. I should have known immediately something was wrong. My father never apologized for anything. Not when he lied. Not when he embarrassed people. Not even when he destroyed relationships he couldn't repair. But hearing my mother sound emotional did something to me. It made me remember the version of my family that existed before money turned every conversation into manipulation. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe maybe enough time had passed for people to finally change. The first thing I noticed wasn't the restaurant. It was the silence. 16 members of my family sat around that long private table pretending to smile like this was some kind of happy reunion. My father sat near the center with his expensive watch glimmering under the dim lights, acting like the last 3 years had never happened. My younger brother Mason immediately looked down at his drink the second I walked in. My cousins suddenly became fascinated with their phones. Even the waitress standing beside the table looked uncomfortable. The whole room felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain yet. Still, I sat down because part of me kept hoping I was imagining things. Maybe everybody was nervous. Maybe we just needed time. But deep down, I could already feel the same tension that used to fill our house before one of my father's angry outbursts. The kind of silence where everybody knows something bad is coming but nobody wants to say it first. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first, dinner almost felt normal. My Aunt Rebecca kept talking about her new beach condo in Florida. My mother asked me questions about work like she was trying to prevent quiet moments from turning uncomfortable. My father ordered bottle after bottle of expensive wine without even glancing at the prices. That detail mattered more than I realized at the time because my father had spent most of his life pretending money wasn't a problem while secretly drowning in debt. Growing up, appearances meant everything to him. Luxury dinners. Expensive suits. Country club memberships he couldn't afford. And whenever things finally started collapsing, someone else in the family was expected to rescue him before the truth reached everybody else. Most of the time, that person was me. I was the dependable daughter. The successful one. The person everyone called whenever another crisis needed fixing. Over the years I paid overdue mortgage bills, covered medical expenses, loaned money that was never repaid, and listened to promises that always turned into excuses. The night everything finally broke apart happened 3 years earlier inside my parents' kitchen. My father asked me for another loan, this time almost $40,000. He claimed it was for a business investment that would pay him back within months. But later that night my younger brother Mason got drunk and accidentally admitted there was no business investment. My father had been gambling again. Worse than before. thousands disappearing every month while he continued pretending everything was under control. I remember standing there feeling something inside me finally snap, hearing the truth out loud. Suddenly every emergency, every desperate request for help, every guilt trip about family loyalty finally made sense. When I confronted my father, he exploded. He accused me of thinking I was better than everyone because I had money. Then he pointed toward the front door and told me if money mattered so much to me, I could leave and never come back. So I did. And nobody stopped me. Which is why the invitation to dinner made absolutely no sense. Families don't suddenly reconnect after 3 years without a reason. Especially not families like mine. The entire drive downtown, I kept replaying my mother's words in my head, trying to figure out what she wasn't saying. Then 20 minutes before I reached the restaurant, something happened that changed everything. I stopped at a gas station because my phone battery was almost dead. While I was inside paying for a charger, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost ignored it. A man on the other end asked if this was Adele Carson. His voice sounded nervous, rushed, like someone afraid of being overheard. He told me he worked at the restaurant where my family was waiting. Then he asked me a question that made my stomach drop instantly. He said, "Ma'am, did you personally authorize a $12,000 private dining reservation under your name tonight?" I remember standing completely still in the middle of that gas station while every sound around me disappeared. I told him no. Absolutely not. There was a long silence before he quietly said, "I thought you deserved to know before you arrived." Then the call ended. I stared at my phone for almost a full minute trying to understand what was happening. Part of me wanted to get back into my car and drive home immediately. But another part of me needed answers. I needed to know how far my family was willing to go. So I drove to the restaurant anyway. And sitting there at the center of the table, smiling like everything was perfectly normal, was my younger brother Mason. The same brother who suddenly couldn't hold eye contact with me for more than a second. At the time, I didn't realize Mason had already made one mistake before dinner even started. A mistake that would eventually bring the entire night crashing down around him. By the time I turned 28, I had already spent most of my adult life fixing problems that didn't belong to me. While people my age were getting married, traveling, or posting pictures of perfect lives online, I was working 12-hour shifts managing one of the busiest restaurants in Minneapolis and answering phone calls from relatives who only seemed to remember I existed when they needed money. I wasn't married. I didn't have children. Most nights I went home to a quiet apartment, reheated leftovers from work, and fell asleep with my phone still in my hand because someone in my family always needed something before morning. Looking back now, I think I confused being needed with being loved. And my family knew exactly how to use that against me. I started helping them financially when I was 19 years old. My father had just lost another job after arguing with his manager, something he had a habit of doing whenever authority bruised his ego. My mother called me crying because the electricity bill was overdue and they were days away from losing power in the middle of winter. I remember sitting in the employee break room at my first restaurant job transferring almost my entire paycheck to my parents while telling myself it was temporary. That's the dangerous thing about helping people you love. The first time feels like kindness. The second time feels like responsibility. Then eventually it becomes expectation. After that first payment, the calls never stopped. My younger brother Mason needed help covering rent after quitting another job. My Aunt Rebecca needed money for medical bills that somehow never seemed to get paid off. My cousin Derek borrowed money for a business opportunity that disappeared within months. Every emergency somehow found its way back to me. And every single time, I said yes. At first, I believed helping family was simply what good people did. My parents raised me to believe loyalty mattered more than anything else. My father used to say blood should never keep score. But somehow the people saying that were always the ones taking, never giving. Over time, my role inside the family became painfully clear. I wasn't Adele anymore. I was the responsible one. The dependable daughter. The person everyone called after they had already ruined their own lives. When Mason crashed his car driving drunk, I paid for the repairs because my father said a police record would destroy his future. When my mother secretly fell behind on mortgage payments, I drained nearly half my savings to stop the bank from foreclosing on their house. One Christmas, I spent more money buying gifts for everyone else than I spent on myself the entire year. Nobody asked if I could afford it. They just assumed I would handle it like I always did. Some families only call when they need something. Mine perfected it. The hardest part wasn't losing money. It was watching people slowly stop seeing me as a person. Somewhere along the way, my family stopped asking how I was doing unless the conversation eventually led to a favor. They knew my work schedule better than my birthday because they only called after payday. Sometimes I would stare at my phone before answering and already know exactly what the conversation would be. It always started the same way. Small talk. Fake concern. Then eventually the real reason appeared. Somebody needed help. Somebody was behind on bills. Somebody made another mistake. And somehow I became responsible for fixing all of it. I kept telling myself things would change once everyone got back on their feet, but nobody in my family ever stayed on their feet long enough to stop leaning on me. The truth is, I worked incredibly hard for everything I had. Managing a restaurant sounds glamorous until you actually live it. Most mornings started before sunrise and ended long after midnight. I dealt with angry customers, employees who quit without warning, suppliers missing deliveries, and owners demanding impossible numbers every month. There were nights I stood in the office crying quietly from exhaustion before walking back onto the floor smiling at guests like nothing was wrong. But I loved the work because it gave me something my family never did: stability. Inside the restaurant, effort mattered. Discipline mattered. If you worked harder, things improved. At home, hard work only made people expect more from me. My father especially treated my success like it belonged to the family instead of me. Whenever relatives complimented my career, he found ways to take credit for it. He loved telling people he raised a strong daughter, even though he spent most of my 20s asking me for money while criticizing the hours I worked to earn it. What hurt the most was watching my mother stay silent through all of it. She saw everything. She knew how often I sacrificed for the family. But years of living with my father had taught her survival depended on avoiding conflict. So instead of defending me, she learned how to quietly accept things she should have challenged years ago. The older I got, the more I started noticing how differently my family treated Mason compared to me. Mason was 32 years old and somehow still everybody's victim whenever life went wrong. He quit jobs constantly, blamed other people for his failures, and somehow always ended up back at my parents' house needing another rescue. But nobody ever demanded accountability from him. My father called him misunderstood. My mother said he was finding himself. Meanwhile, I was expected to carry responsibilities nobody else wanted. I remember one Thanksgiving when Mason showed up 2 hours late smelling like alcohol while I had spent the entire morning cooking for 16 people after finishing a 10-hour shift the night before. My father toasted Mason for going through a hard time while barely acknowledging anything I'd done. That was the moment I realized my role in the family had never been to be loved equally. My role was to hold everything together quietly while everyone else fell apart loudly. Still, despite everything, I kept helping them. Because every time I tried creating distance, guilt followed me like a shadow. My mother would cry. My father would accuse me of abandoning the family. Relatives would suddenly remind me how much family matters. Nobody mentioned how family only seemed to matter whenever somebody needed access to my bank account. I spent years convincing myself loyalty meant sacrifice. I thought enduring emotional exhaustion made me a good daughter. But eventually something changes inside you when people keep taking pieces of your life without ever asking what it's costing you. And then came the night 3 years ago that finally broke everything between us. My father called me over to the house saying he needed to discuss something important privately. When I arrived, Mason was already there sitting at the kitchen table avoiding eye contact. My mother looked nervous. I knew immediately another financial disaster had happened. My father explained he needed nearly $40,000 for what he described as a short-term investment problem. The way he said it sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced the speech before I arrived. I asked questions. He became defensive instantly. Then Mason accidentally destroyed the entire story with one sentence. He admitted the money wasn't for an investment. My father had lost it gambling over several months and was desperate to stop creditors from coming after the house. I remember staring at my father waiting for him to deny it. He didn't. He just looked angry that the truth finally reached me. Something inside me cracked that night. Years of stress, resentment, exhaustion, and humiliation suddenly rose to the surface all at once. I asked him how long he planned on using me to clean up his mistakes. My father exploded. He accused me of acting superior because I had money. He said family should help each other without asking questions. Then he pointed toward the front door and told me if money mattered more than family, I could leave and never come back. So I did. And not one person at that table tried to stop me. The longer I stayed away from my family, the more I started realizing how abnormal my childhood had actually been. Distance has a strange way of exposing things you spent years trying to excuse. Growing up, everything in our house revolved around my father's moods. If he was happy, everyone relaxed. If he was angry, the entire house felt heavy. My father, Richard Carson, cared deeply about appearances. To outsiders, he was charming, confident, successful. The kind of man who shook hands firmly, tipped loudly in restaurants, and spoke like someone who always knew exactly what he was doing. But inside the house, things were different. Bills disappeared unopened into kitchen drawers. Debt collectors called constantly. My mother learned how to lower the television volume whenever arguments started so the neighbors wouldn't hear. And every time another financial disaster happened, my father found a way to make it somebody else's responsibility. Usually mine. Even after I left, I still heard things through relatives. My father's gambling had gotten worse after I cut contact with the family. He bounced between sports betting, poker rooms, and online casinos like somebody convinced the next win would magically fix years of bad decisions. It never did. But pride prevented him from admitting he had a problem. Instead, he created stories. Investments gone wrong. Friends who owed him money. Temporary setbacks. My father could turn any lie into something that sounded believable if it protected his image long enough. And my mother helped him do it. Not because she was cruel, but because after 30 years of marriage, she had become an expert at surviving him. Silence became her defense mechanism. She avoided conflict the way some people avoid fire. If my father exploded, she calmed him. If he lied, she looked away. If someone got hurt, she quietly cleaned up the emotional mess afterward and pretended everything was normal again by morning. Then there was Mason. Out of everyone in the family, Mason hurt me the most because he was the one person I genuinely believed would eventually change. Growing up, he was funny, protective, and incredibly smart when he actually applied himself. But somewhere in his 20s, something shifted. Maybe it was laziness. Maybe insecurity. Maybe years of watching my father escape consequences taught him accountability didn't matter. Whatever the reason, Mason slowly became the kind of man who always had a new plan but never followed through on any of them. Every few months there was another business idea. A car detailing company. Online sports merchandise. Cryptocurrency investments. Sports betting systems he swore could never fail. Every plan collapsed the same way. Fast excitement followed by debt, excuses, and another phone call asking somebody else for help. I lost count of how many times I rescued him financially. I paid overdue rent to stop him from getting evicted twice. Once, I wired him nearly $4,000 because he claimed his utilities had been shut off in the middle of winter. Another time he cried on the phone telling me loan sharks were threatening him over gambling debts. I remember sitting alone in my apartment at 2 a.m. transferring money into his account while he promised me through tears that he was done gambling forever. 3 weeks later, I found out he'd spent part of that money betting on football games. That's the thing about loving people who constantly destroy themselves. You start confusing rescue with love. You convince yourself that if you help them one more time, maybe this time will finally be different. But it never was. What made everything worse was the way my father defended Mason no matter what happened. If Mason lost money gambling, my father blamed stress. If he quit another job, my father said he was too talented to work for difficult bosses. Meanwhile, every mistake I made was treated like failure. When I worked long hours managing the restaurant, my father accused me of caring more about work than family. When I stopped loaning money, he called me selfish. Somehow I was expected to sacrifice endlessly while Mason was protected from consequences like he was still a child. And my mother stood quietly in the middle of it all, pretending balance existed where there was none. The longer I stayed away, the more relatives started reaching out privately, telling me things they never admitted before. My Aunt Rebecca confessed the family was struggling financially worse than I realized. Credit card debt. Second mortgages. Loans borrowed from one relative to pay another. My father apparently owed money to multiple people across town. But even hearing all that, I still didn't understand why they suddenly wanted me back after 3 years. Families like mine don't reunite because they miss each other. They reunite because they need something. Then 2 weeks before the dinner, I received a phone call that changed everything. It happened late Tuesday night while I was closing the restaurant. We'd had a brutal dinner rush, and I was sitting alone in the office finishing payroll when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it because it was close to midnight, but something made me answer anyway. A woman introduced herself as Lindsay. At first, the name meant nothing to me. Then she explained she used to work at the steakhouse where my family planned to have dinner. She sounded nervous, like someone debating whether they were making a mistake by calling. I asked how she got my number. There was a pause before she admitted Mason had left it with the restaurant manager while arranging the reservation. The second she mentioned Mason's name, my stomach tightened. Lindsay told me she no longer worked there, but many of her friends still did. According to her, my brother had been calling the restaurant constantly for over a week, making special requests about the reservation. Private dining room. Premium wine packages. Custom menu upgrades. Additional guests added at the last minute. Expensive whiskey bottles requested in advance. Thousands of dollars worth of arrangements attached directly to my name. At first, she assumed it was normal because the reservation listed me as the primary financial contact. But then one of the servers overheard Mason joking about how my sister always pays eventually. That was apparently the moment things started feeling wrong enough for someone to speak up. I remember gripping the edge of my desk so hard my hands started shaking. Lindsay lowered her voice and said something I still think about to this day. She said, "I don't know your family, but the way your brother was talking, it sounded planned." Planned. That word stayed stuck in my head long after the call ended. I asked her how expensive the reservation looked. There was another pause before she quietly answered, "Right now it's already close to $12,000. For a moment, I honestly thought I might be sick. $12,000. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That wasn't somebody accidentally ordering too much food. That was intention. Deliberate planning. And suddenly every strange thing about the dinner invitation started making sense. The sudden reconciliation. My mother sounding emotional on the phone. My father wanting peace. They weren't trying to rebuild the family. They were setting a table. And somehow, I was supposed to pay for it. I barely slept after that call. I spent hours lying awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I'd had with my family over the years. Every guilt trip. Every apology that turned into another request. Every time I ignored my instincts because I wanted to believe the people who raised me actually loved me more than they loved what I could provide. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I realized something painful. The dinner was never about reconciliation. It was about access. They missed the version of me that solved problems financially. The version they could manipulate. The version too exhausted to finally say enough. But what they didn't realize was this time felt different. Because for the first time in my life, I was finally starting to see them clearly. And please subscribe to join our family. I spent the next 2 weeks trying to convince myself I was overreacting. That maybe Lindsay misunderstood the situation. Maybe my family was simply celebrating too aggressively because they were genuinely happy to see me again. But every time I started doubting myself, another memory surfaced. Another unpaid loan. Another manipulative apology. Another moment where I ignored my instincts because I wanted to believe the people I loved would eventually stop hurting me. Deep down, I already knew something was wrong. The question wasn't whether my family had planned something. The question was how far they were willing to go. And for reasons I still don't fully understand, I decided to attend the dinner anyway. Maybe part of me needed closure. Maybe I wanted proof that I wasn't crazy for finally pulling away from them. Or maybe after spending years being treated like the family safety net, I simply wanted to see what happened when I stopped acting like one. The restaurant sat near the center of downtown Minneapolis inside one of those luxury hotels where everything smells expensive before you even reach the front door. Valet attendants rushed between cars in black uniforms while couples dressed in tailored suits disappeared through the revolving entrance laughing softly to each other. I remember sitting inside my car for almost 2 full minutes staring at the building before finally turning off the engine. My chest felt tight. Every instinct told me to leave. But then my phone buzzed with a text from my mother saying, "Everyone's excited to see you." Reading those words hurt more than it should have because for years that was all I ever wanted from them. To feel wanted. To feel missed. To feel like my value inside the family existed beyond whatever financial emergency I could solve. So I took a deep breath, fixed my expression in the rearview mirror, and walked inside pretending my hands weren't shaking. The hostess smiled politely the moment I gave my name. But something changed in her face almost immediately afterward. It was subtle. Just a quick flicker of recognition before she forced the smile back into place. That moment stayed with me. She led me through the crowded dining room toward a large private section near the back where my family was already seated. I could hear them before I reached the table. Loud laughter. Glasses clinking. My father's voice carrying above everyone else like he owned the building. Then suddenly the entire table went quiet the second I appeared. Nobody moved at first. It felt less like arriving at a family dinner and more like walking into a meeting where everyone already knew something I didn't. Then the performance started. My mother stood up first and wrapped her arms around me tightly, holding on a little too long like she was trying to convince both of us this reunion was real. My Aunt Rebecca immediately started talking about how beautiful I looked. My cousin smiled awkwardly while avoiding direct eye contact. Even Mason forced himself to stand and hug me, though I could feel tension in his body the entire time. He smelled faintly like whiskey already. My father stayed seated for several seconds before finally standing with that polished smile he used whenever strangers were watching. He hugged me with one arm and quietly said, "Glad you finally decided to come home." Home. That word almost made me laugh. Because nothing about that table felt safe enough to call home anymore. At first, the conversation stayed harmless. My cousins talked about work. My aunt complained about rising gas prices. My mother kept asking questions about the restaurant I managed like she was desperately trying to keep the evening balanced before something ruined it. But underneath every conversation, I could feel tension pressing against the table. Small things started standing out immediately. My father kept ordering the most expensive bottles of wine without discussing prices. Mason encouraged people to order whatever they want multiple times before appetizers even arrived. My Uncle Greg added seafood towers nobody asked for. Every few minutes another plate appeared. Another bottle opened. Another expensive item quietly added itself to the total. And every single time something expensive arrived, someone glanced at me. Not openly. just quickly enough to notice. That was the moment I realized Lindsay had been telling the truth. This wasn't dinner. This was preparation. About an hour into the meal, Mason leaned back in his chair laughing loudly after ordering another glass of premium whiskey and said, "Come on, Adele, live a little." The way he said my name felt loaded somehow, like there was a private joke happening around me that I hadn't fully heard yet. A few relatives laughed nervously. My father smirked without looking up from his drink. Then he added, "It's family. Don't be cheap." Cheap. I remember hearing that word and feeling something shift quietly inside me. Because the same people calling me cheap had spent years depending on my money to survive. I looked around the table slowly after he said it. My mother immediately stared down at her plate. My cousins suddenly became very interested in their food. Nobody defended me. Nobody said the comment was unfair. And in that moment I understood something painful. Silence can be just as cruel as words when people watch you being humiliated and choose comfort over honesty. Still, I stayed calm. That seemed to bother my father more than if I had argued. As dinner continued, the comments became sharper. My father joked loudly about how successful I'd become while everyone else struggled. Mason laughed about how nice it must be having all that disposable income. My Aunt Rebecca casually mentioned how family should help family without keeping score. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Carefully designed to make me feel guilty before the bill even arrived. And the worst part wasn't the manipulation. It was realizing how many times similar conversations had worked on me before. Then finally, after nearly 3 hours, dessert plates were cleared from the table. And everything changed. The waiter approached slowly holding a black leather check presenter in both hands. I'll never forget the expression on his face. He looked uncomfortable. Almost apologetic. Like somebody forced into the middle of an argument they never wanted to witness. For one brief second, nobody at the table moved. Then my father calmly reached forward, took the check from the waiter, and opened it. I watched his eyes scan the total. No surprise. No hesitation. Just satisfaction. Then he closed the booklet slowly, slid it across the table directly toward me, looked me dead in the eyes, and said 6 words that made the entire room feel cold. "You owe this family, Adele." Nobody spoke after that. Not even the waiter. I looked down at the bill sitting in front of me. $12,487.63. For a second, I honestly thought I might pass out. My chest tightened so hard it became difficult to breathe. I stared at the number trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. But then I started noticing everyone's reactions around the table. My cousins refused to look at me. My mother sat completely frozen with tears building quietly in her eyes but still saying nothing. Mason leaned back in his chair smirking slightly into his whiskey glass like he'd been waiting for this moment all night. Even the waiter looked deeply uncomfortable standing beside the table. And suddenly every strange moment from the evening connected all at once. The fake smiles. The forced reunion. The endless expensive orders. The jokes about money. The pressure. The guilt. It had all been leading here. This wasn't a family dinner. It was an ambush. My father folded his hands calmly and said, "After everything this family's done for you, this really shouldn't be a problem." I almost laughed hearing that sentence. Because the truth was the exact opposite. I had spent years sacrificing pieces of my life to keep these people afloat while they slowly convinced themselves I somehow owed them for the privilege. And sitting there staring at that $12,000 bill, I realized something heartbreaking. They never invited me there because they missed me. They invited me because they believed I was still weak enough to manipulate. The silence around the table became unbearable. Nobody moved. Nobody defended me. It felt like 16 people were sitting there waiting to see whether I would finally break one last time. Then my father pushed the bill slightly closer toward me and quietly said, "Don't embarrass the family." That sentence did something to me. Because after years of humiliation, exhaustion, manipulation, and emotional guilt, I suddenly stopped feeling hurt. And started feeling angry. Real anger. The kind that arrives quietly. The kind that changes things permanently. I looked down at the bill one final time. Then I looked directly at the waiter standing beside the table. And I said 5 words that changed the entire night. Bring me the itemized receipts. The second those words left my mouth, the entire atmosphere around the table changed. Up until that moment, my family still believed they controlled the situation. They thought shame would pressure me into staying quiet the same way it always had before. That was their pattern. Corner me emotionally, make me feel guilty, then wait for me to surrender so everyone could avoid discomfort. But when I calmly asked for the itemized receipts instead of reaching for my wallet, I saw something flicker across Mason's face for the first time all night. Panic. Small at first. Barely noticeable unless you were looking directly at him the way I was. My father's confident expression tightened slightly too, though he recovered fast enough that most people at the table probably missed it. But I didn't. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was paying attention. The waiter hesitated before quietly nodding and walking away with the bill folder clutched tightly against his chest. Nobody spoke while he disappeared toward the back office. My father leaned back slowly in his chair and forced out a dry laugh like he was trying to convince the rest of the table this was still under control. Adele, he said calmly, don't turn this into a scene. That sentence almost amazed me. After orchestrating an entire public humiliation in the middle of an upscale restaurant, somehow he still wanted me to worry about appearances. My mother finally looked up at me then, her eyes glossy with emotion, but even now she said nothing. She just sat there silently twisting her wedding ring around her finger the same way she used to during arguments when I was growing up. Watching her hurt me almost more than the bill itself because deep down I think she knew exactly what they were doing long before I arrived that night. She just didn't stop it. Mason suddenly leaned forward trying to regain control of the conversation. Come on, Adele, he said with this fake smile stretched across his face, it's just dinner. Just dinner. $12,000 reduced to 2 careless words. I stared at him for several seconds without answering, and the longer I stayed quiet, the more uncomfortable he became. People who manipulate others usually depend on emotional reactions. They expect anger, tears, guilt, defensiveness. Silence unsettles them because silence forces truth into the room. Around us, the rest of the restaurant continued moving normally while our table sat frozen inside this strange tension nobody wanted to acknowledge openly. I noticed my cousins refusing to look directly at me again. My Uncle Greg suddenly became fascinated with his untouched coffee. Nobody defended what was happening because that would require admitting they all knew something about this dinner long before I did. Then the waiter returned carrying several printed pages. I'll never forget the way his hands shook slightly while placing them beside me. Here are the itemized receipts, ma'am, he said quietly. The table went silent again. I lowered my eyes toward the pages and immediately realized the situation was even worse than I thought. The charges stretched across multiple receipts, multiple times, and multiple authorizations. Premium whiskey bottles ordered before the dinner officially started. 2 seafood towers added nearly an hour before I even arrived. Private dining room upgrades approved earlier that morning. Expensive wine packages authorized under my name. I kept flipping through the pages slowly while everyone watched me. The deeper I looked, the colder I felt. This wasn't impulsive spending. This had been carefully arranged ahead of time. Planned down to the smallest detail. Then I found the timestamp. Several charges had been approved nearly 3 hours before I entered the restaurant. I looked up directly at Mason. His face immediately changed. That was the moment everybody at the table realized the night was no longer going according to plan. I asked the waiter a simple question. Who authorized these charges? The poor guy looked trapped standing there between a furious family and a customer who had clearly been set up. He hesitated before answering carefully. The reservation was placed under your name, ma'am. We were told all additional expenses had been pre-approved. I could actually hear my heartbeat at that point. Then I asked the question that finally cracked everything open. Who told you that? The waiter looked toward Mason instinctively before quickly looking away again. And suddenly the entire table exploded into nervous movement all at once. Mason immediately started talking over everyone. My father interrupted him halfway through. My Aunt Rebecca tried laughing awkwardly like this was all some giant misunderstanding. My mother covered her mouth with one trembling hand. But none of it mattered anymore because the truth was already sitting there in front of me printed across those receipts. Mason had used my name to secure the reservation. Mason authorized thousands of dollars worth of upgrades before I even arrived. Mason had spent the entire evening pretending this was a reunion while quietly building a financial trap around me. And the worst part wasn't even the money. It was realizing they'd rehearsed this. That realization hit me harder than the betrayal itself. Because suddenly every moment from the evening made sense in the most painful way possible. The fake warmth. The forced hugs. The comments about family loyalty. Even my father's speech about peace. They weren't reconnecting with me. They were performing. Every smile had a purpose. Every conversation had direction. They needed me emotionally softened before the bill appeared because deep down they knew exactly how wrong this was. I looked directly at Mason and quietly asked, "How long have you been planning this?" For a second, he actually looked ashamed. Then my father stepped in before he could answer. "You're overreacting," he snapped sharply. "Nobody forced you to come here." I remember staring at him completely stunned hearing those words. Nobody forced me to come here. As if manipulation somehow stopped counting if the victim walked willingly into the room. That was the moment I finally understood something about my father that took me almost 30 years to accept. He genuinely believed other people existed to absorb the consequences of his decisions. Accountability never reached him because someone else always cleaned up the damage before reality caught up. Usually me. But not this time. I turned back toward the waiter and calmly asked another question. "Do you have recordings of the reservation calls?" The entire table froze. Because everyone there suddenly understood what I already knew. Restaurants like this record phone confirmations. The waiter hesitated again before quietly saying, "Yes, ma'am. Management keeps all reservation recordings for large private events." I watched the color drain slowly from Mason's face. My father stood up so quickly his chair scraped loudly across the floor. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "We're leaving." But it was already too late. The restaurant manager had apparently been watching this situation unfold from nearby because within seconds he approached the table alongside another employee from security. The moment management arrived, Mason's confidence completely disappeared. He started stumbling over explanations, blaming misunderstandings, claiming everybody agreed to split costs evenly. But the receipts told a different story. The reservation logs told a different story. And deep down, everyone at that table knew it. Then the manager quietly asked the question that finally shattered whatever control my father thought he still had. "Did Ms. Carson authorize these charges personally?" Silence. Nobody answered. Not my father. Not Mason. Not even my mother. And that silence said everything. The manager's expression changed immediately after that. Professional. Serious. Controlled. He explained calmly that using another person's identity to authorize thousands of dollars in charges without consent could become a legal issue very quickly. The word legal seemed to hit Mason harder than anything else that night. He stood abruptly and started insisting this was just family business. But the more he talked, the worse things became. Because desperation has a way of exposing truth faster than honesty ever does. Then the manager said something I'll never forget. "If necessary, we may need to involve law enforcement." The second those words entered the conversation, panic spread across the table instantly. My mother began crying quietly. My Aunt Rebecca started begging everyone to calm down. My father looked furious enough to explode. And Mason? Mason looked terrified. Real fear. The kind that appears when someone suddenly realizes consequences are no longer theoretical. And sitting there watching my entire family collapse under the weight of their own decisions, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I just felt tired. Because the people humiliating themselves in that restaurant weren't strangers. They were still my family. And somehow that made everything hurt even more. The successful one in the family. Carol added, "Your father wanted one beautiful family dinner before his surgery." The surgery. Another lie. My father wasn't even scheduled for surgery. I had already confirmed that days earlier through a family friend who worked at the hospital. They invented an emotional story hoping guilt would force me into silence. I looked directly at my father. "Dad," I said quietly. "Are you really going into surgery?" He froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. Ethan immediately jumped in trying to redirect the conversation. "Why are you interrogating him?" he snapped. "Just pay the bill and stop making everything difficult." That sentence changed the entire energy at the table. Because suddenly the mask started slipping. The fake warmth disappeared. The smiles faded. And underneath all of it was exactly what I expected. Entitlement. I slowly closed the bill folder and placed it back on the table. "I'm not paying this," I said calmly. Silence hit the table so hard it almost felt physical. Vanessa stared at me like she misheard me. Carol's jaw tightened instantly. Ethan leaned forward aggressively. "What do you mean you're not paying?" he demanded. I stayed calm. "I mean exactly what I said." My father finally spoke, his voice cold now. "After everything this family has done for you, you can't even cover one dinner?" I almost laughed again because the manipulation had become so predictable. Everything this family had done for me? My mother worked double shifts when I was young while my father gambled half the rent money away. When I got my first decent job, Ethan borrowed thousands he never repaid. Vanessa destroyed her credit cards and expected me to clean it up. Carol constantly reminded me that family supports family while contributing nothing herself. And every time I helped them, they acted grateful for about 3 days before demanding more. So this dinner wasn't some misunderstanding. It was an ambush. Public pressure. Emotional blackmail. They believed the expensive restaurant and crowded room would trap me into submission. But what they didn't know was that I had already prepared for this exact moment. Ethan suddenly reached across the table and grabbed the bill. "Fine," he said loudly. "If you're too selfish to help your own family, I'll handle it." The confidence in his voice immediately caught my attention. Then I noticed something strange. He pulled out a credit card under my name. For a second, the entire table went quiet again. Ethan tried swiping the card quickly like he hoped nobody would notice. But I noticed instantly because I had never given him access to any card under my account. My stomach dropped, not from fear, but from disbelief. He had actually crossed into fraud. Real fraud. The waiter looked confused when the payment declined. Ethan's face changed immediately. He tried again. Declined. Then he laughed nervously and muttered something about the machine malfunctioning. But before he could try a third time, 2 security guards approached the table. Right behind them was the restaurant manager I had spoken to earlier. The manager looked directly at Ethan. "Sir," he said calmly, "we need to discuss the card you attempted to use." Every ounce of confidence disappeared from Ethan's face. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. The manager stayed calm. "The card belongs to another guest at this table, and we were informed ahead of time there may be an attempted unauthorized transaction tonight." Vanessa immediately stood up panicking. Carol started yelling that this was all some misunderstanding. Ethan looked directly at me then, finally realizing I had anticipated everything. "You set me up," he whispered. I stared back at him without emotion. "No," I said quietly. "You set yourself up." Then security asked Ethan to step away from the table. That's when everything exploded. My father suddenly stood up yelling at the guards to stop. Carol started blaming Vanessa. Vanessa started crying and screaming that Ethan said this plan would work. And Ethan completely lost control. He pointed at me shouting that I owed the family for abandoning them. People across the restaurant turned to stare. Phones came out. The perfect public humiliation they planned for me had reversed completely onto them. And then something happened I never expected. My father looked at me differently for the first time in years. Not angry. Not manipulative. Just tired. Completely broken. As security continued speaking with Ethan near the entrance, my father slowly sat back down and covered his face with his hands. His voice became small. Weak. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Nobody at the table moved. I honestly thought I misheard him. My father never apologized. Not once in my entire life. But now, with the entire scheme collapsing publicly around him, something inside him finally cracked. "I shouldn't have agreed to this," he whispered. Carol immediately snapped at him to stop talking, but he ignored her. He looked directly at me, his eyes full of shame. "I let this family become poisonous," he admitted. "And I kept expecting you to fix everything." Hearing those words hurt more than all the insults earlier that night because part of me had waited my entire life to hear accountability from him. But it came far too late. Security then informed Ethan they were contacting police regarding attempted credit fraud. My father immediately panicked and begged them not to involve law enforcement. Carol started screaming that the restaurant was overreacting. Vanessa blamed Ethan completely, claiming she never knew about the stolen card. The entire family turned against each other within seconds. Years of fake loyalty vanished the moment consequences arrived. And as I sat there watching all of them unravel publicly, I realized something painful. They were never united by love. They were united by dependency. The moment survival entered the room, they abandoned each other instantly. I paid only for my own meal, left cash on the table for the waiter, and stood up to leave. Nobody stopped me. Nobody apologized except my father, and even his apology felt buried under decades of damage. As I walked toward the exit, Ethan was still arguing with security near the front entrance while guests stared from every direction. The same brother who spent years mocking my boundaries now looked terrified. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for refusing to rescue him. That night taught me something painful. Some people don't love you. They love access to you. Access to your money. Your stability. Your kindness. Your willingness to sacrifice yourself so they never have to face consequences. And the moment you finally say no, they reveal who they really are. I used to believe family loyalty meant enduring anything no matter how badly people treated you. But loyalty without respect becomes slavery disguised as love. Walking out of that restaurant alone felt strangely peaceful because for the first time, I wasn't carrying their chaos anymore. I wasn't cleaning up another disaster they created. I wasn't funding another manipulation disguised as an emergency. I was finally free from the role they assigned me years ago. The provider. The rescuer. The fool they thought would always say yes. So let me ask you something. If your own family tried to humiliate you publicly, would you forgive them? Or would that be the last dinner you ever attended? And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, revenge, and real-life family drama, subscribe now. Because the next story might be even more shocking.